1, 2. Could I invite everybody to take their seats, please? We're going to start in a couple of minutes. Please come to the front. We're expecting more to join us, but it'd be great if you could huddle on the second and third rows. And there'll be time at the end to continue breakfast. And hello also to all of those joining us online. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for having got up on day 3 of this FFD conference to join us for breakfast for a very exciting conversation. My name is Eloise Todd. I'm head of Pandemic Action Network, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today alongside our partners, ODI Europe, the Europe Lang Institute, and Salud por Derecho. And we've got some amazing speakers here for you today. And what we're going to be talking about is an issue on everybody's mind and one that we've been discussing all week. And that's the issue of development cooperation and development aid. Right now is a very tricky time in the development finance world. There have been swinging cuts, particularly in the US, but not only. We know that it's been tough times for some European countries too. So we think it's more important than ever to make the case for development cooperation from different perspectives. And today we'll hear from Maximiliano about some research that he was deeply involved in, that we asked them to do to show what the economic benefit is to European countries when they invest in development aid. This is not something that NGOs have traditionally talked about so much. But it's really important that we look at all sides of this equation when key decisions are being taken. So we'll have a presentation from Max, and then we'll move to a panel discussion with a very distinguished panel who I'll introduce later. And then we'll have a chance for Q&A from the floor, and also for some with those of you joining us online today. And today's session will be recorded. That's important for our speakers to know. So you will be able to refer to it later as well. So without further ado, I'd love to invite Maximiliano Mendez-Parra, the Principal Research Fellow of ODI Global, to come and present his findings on stage. Max, the floor is yours. Thank you so much. Give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. Buenos días. Very happy to be here today and have this opportunity of sort of presenting our work of my colleagues, Johannes Agele, Dirk William Tevelde, and myself, where we tried actually to provide some quantification of what are the economic impact of EU aid on the EU economy. And this is something that we have worked for a long time with the idea of showing how is that aid, in addition to having extremely positive impact on the recipient countries, is also benefiting the donor countries at the same time. So my presentation is going to be quite simple. I would like to discuss first about the pathways. I will try to outline how is that aid will affect, or is expected to affect the donor countries. What are the channels for that to happen? This is going to be much of an economic tacky discussion. I will try to keep it as interesting and not very boring. Then I want to make a description of the model that we have used to assess the impact of aid. Then describing specifically how is that we have made this exercise, particularly what are the sort of assumptions that we had made in the process, presenting some results, and then try to compare our results with that other researchers or previous work have been done before. So we there is a very good literature about the impact of aid on recipient country. I'm focusing exclusively on the economic side here. I mean, I'm not focusing on any other of the other dimensions that aid could impact the countries. And a very much recent study that says that basically the 2022 aid have raised income in low-income countries by 3%, and specifically in sub-Saharan Africa by 1%. That doesn't sound much, but this is when you compare it in terms of the current volumes of aid, that it had been the effect. So this is the impact that aid is having. And this impact, this fact that basically that is sort of boosting the economies of the recipient countries have impacts on the donor countries, and in this case specifically the EU. These impacts are through a couple of channels. The first one, and this is the one that we are going to be discussing in a lot of detail, is the impact that this increasing in income in the recipient countries have on the EU exports. So more income in the recipient countries is translated eventually more demand for goods, including those coming from the EU. At the same time, EU consumers may benefit from cheaper imports from these beneficiary countries through different channels that I want to explain in a minute. This also lead to an increase in foreign direct investment, that is FDI, what FDI stands for, into the recipient countries, which boost overseas profits for corporations in the donor countries. And of course, aid contribute to a series of global public goods in terms of economic stability, better institutions, etc., that benefit the economies of the donor countries. So I'm going to try to be as fast and clear as possible in relation to the methodology. We have used the GTAP model. I mean, it's a model that has been around for quite a while, and it's sort of a model that relates all the economies in the world through trade. So all the economies are sort of interconnected in our model through trade flows. The model provides a very comprehensive representation of the global economy with a wide range of economic sectors, around 60 sectors, and all the countries in the world. But also, more interestingly, is that also internally in each of the countries, all the different dimensions, consumption, investment, trade, production, and so on, are properly interrelated. So that allows us to have a very comprehensive picture of the global economy and their interrelations between countries, between sectors, and between actors of the economy. This model is quite well used in the trade analysis space. So probably if you go and look for impact of Trump tariff, you will see a lot of studies that probably have been used this model. And it had also been used in the past to simulate the impact of aid for trade, because particularly how good is that it has all the trade side model. So how is that the EU aid expect to affect the EU economy? Well, first is some of the aid of the EU will help to reduce trade costs in the recipient countries, and that is expected to lead to an increase in exports. First, I mean, more imports on the recipient countries, leading to more exports from the EU and other partners to the recipient countries. Increased incomes in the recipient countries, such as for more consumption or more infrastructure development, will also increase the recipient imports, leading also to exports. This combination of effects that could go in opposite directions sometimes can also lead to more imports in the EU side. So at the same time that I am reducing the trade cost on the countries, I am also reducing the cost to export. And that means reduce cost to import on the EU side. And at the same time, well, those increased imports in the EU means more consumption in the EU, which is positive for the economy. So how is that we model this? Well, first we aggregate many sectors into 31 economic sectors and into 12 economic regions. This is just to keep things manageable. And then we combined all the aid, the EU aid, probably you know very well, but I'm saying the EU aid, the aid provided between in the current MFS. So basically what we are doing in our simulation is sort of trying to assess what is the effect of current MFF and basically so to extend it into the future. So we assume same distribution in terms of sectors in which aid is disbursed and in countries. But in terms of how is that we model this, we have to accommodate all these different sector aid uses into the type of structure of the model. So the model is quite rigid, so we need to sort of accommodate the data. And we basically sort of simulate 3 types of aid that sort of adjust to different ways of addressing the issue in the model. So the first is aid for trade. That is basically, we have to basically pass everything to US dollars because the model is in dollars. So I will be working, talking about dollars, not in euros. So be aware of that. So basically that this is 7.6 billion of the current MFF. That this is aid for trade. And this is contributing to a reduction on the trade cost. That this has been calibrated through previous literature as a sort of a reduction in the trade cost by 2% in sub-Saharan Africa and 1% in the rest of the world. This has been done from previous econometric studies that have made those relations. Then the other type of aid is the economic and social infrastructure. And this is that we model is that adds to the stock of capital and the incomes in the country. So basically what is working here is that aid is increasing the share, basically aid as a share of a capital stock. So basically what we sort of simulated here is basically calculated how much is represent of the capital stock in the recipient countries. And then the other aid, we simulated that this is a one shift in the consumption. So basically it's a sort of changing, making a jump on how much countries can consume for every, let's say, dollar that they spend. So as I said, we assume that basically that the future aid path follows the current method. And the point that is very important is we are not making any assumptions in terms of economic conditionality here. So the impact here, the EU will benefit in the same way that other countries in the world may benefit from this. So these are our assessment. And basically, we try to relate this to basically sort of euros. So in our study, we found that €1 of aid translates into almost €1 in exports from the EU. And this is also translated also as half a euro or 50 cents in terms of GDP. So in a given year, the aid of the provided by the EU contribute to the EU economy by $12 billion and brings almost 28 billion exports to the EU, as well as reduce imports by 18%. The other thing that we wanted to highlight is that We have made, I'm not presenting it for a question of space, the distribution by member state. Basically, what we found is that all member states benefit in terms of GDP. Of course, in percentage terms, the smaller members, Cyprus, Malta, I think Estonia, are those that will have increases in GDP. If I don't remember wrong, in the case of Malta, it's almost half percentage point increase in GDP. But in terms of value, those that benefit the most are basically those, the largest countries of the EU, but still in percentage terms, a very small percentage. So just to finalize, or basically how we compare our results to previous results, some of them that I have been involved on them and our team were involved before. We have two types of studies, two types of methodologies. The first one is where we try to use what is called gravity models. I'm not going to enter into that, but basically what it's telling us is try to calculate the elasticity of aid for exports. And for example, we found in our study in 2017 is that €1 that was used in the previous MFF, $1, not sorry, of EU aid at that time still the UK was part of the EU, and that have implications, had an impact of almost up to $3.670 depending the country. To the point that we managed to actually have an impact on the number of jobs that this created in the EU, and this was 140,000 jobs at that time. But other studies also have found quite similar numbers. Using a similar methodology that we have used, they have found some sort of similar ranges of impact in terms of how the EU aid is impact on the EU countries. We have also an interesting, because that is quite recent, is what is the impact on the UK economy, just as a reference, of the reduction of aid from 0.7% to 0.5%, then was further reduced, but that was the reduction. And we found that basically that the UK might have lost around $400 million pounds in terms of exports as a result of that reduction. So to finalize, clearly there are positive and quantifiable spillovers on the EU economy as a result of its aid provided to recipient countries. And we estimated that basically the current aid is sort of, in a sense, in terms of exports, is almost paying itself. These results are quite robust based on the review of previous literature. And for us, basically, the main message is that this sort of impact, how this is impacting on the EU economy, this spillovers effect is something that should be taken into consideration in the current discussions for the MFF, because these are clearly non-negligible impacts and helps in a sense actually to shift some narratives about what is the impact of aid that have in the economy. So we hope that this evidence will help in the debate to reach to a better outcome, taking in consideration how the aid can benefit, in addition of benefiting the recipient countries in multiple ways, benefiting the donor countries. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thanks so much, Max. If I could invite you to take a seat here, I'm now going to invite our distinguished panel to join me. If I could invite up Heidy Rombouts, Director General of Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Aid from the Belgium Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You're very welcome, Heidy. Give her a warm round. And Sarah Hunt, Director of Policy in the Development Cooperation Africa Division of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade from Ireland. Aggrey Aluso, Executive Director of Resilience Action Network Africa. And Iliana Olivié, Director of the European Think Tanks Group. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you so much for that rich presentation, Max. Really a lot of food for thought. And I'd like to turn to Heidy first, if I may. How do you see this kind of evidence helping to shape the political case for ODA in Belgium and in Europe more broadly, especially with all the fiscal pressures and competing priorities we're facing right now?
Thank you so much. Thank you for presenting the study, and thank you also for conducting the study. I indeed think that we're all facing this environment in which we have to find the right language. And if I can share from my personal perspective as well, when we're meeting in Sevilla, most of us are very, very knowledgeable about international development cooperation. We know the language, we know the challenges, etc. But the challenge of our time is indeed to have that conversation with people that are not so knowledgeable. And I have found myself indeed in a situation where I have to find the vocabulary, not so much my vocabulary, but the vocabulary of your counterpart. We have a lot of bonding in events such as Sevilla, but we actually have to understand better how we can bridge to those who are not necessarily part of the same world vocabulary, etc. And so I think from that perspective, this type of information is really interesting because this is maybe not necessarily our vocabulary, but maybe it can speak. It can speak to those indeed that are not so familiar with what we are daily working with. And so I think from that perspective, I think that's the first point where it really comes in very useful. From a personal perspective as well, we are looking for tangible examples. These are the macroeconomic figures, I think. We've also identified some of these cases where we actually try to understand what is the vocabulary of the people that we, in a way, we want to convince that what we are doing is actually important from a different perspective and from various perspectives. We have, for example, invested with Belgian Development Corporation in a banana gene data bank. And we have actually found that banana imports are so important for our port of Antwerp that if the Cavendish, which is actually threatened by a disease and there is no cure so far for that disease, that it can actually affect the trade of the port. And sometimes indeed it is by giving these very tangible examples that are a little bit out of our habitual world, let's say, in terms of development cooperation that can actually speak. Another example that we also have is, and I think for me that has to do with where we stand in terms of the crossroad of international cooperation. We have to make good offers in terms of mutual beneficial partnerships. That means that we have to get best at our effort and offer as well. In Belgium, there is quite a good industry in terms of medical products, and we've been able to demonstrate that from the multilateral system, actually there is a lot of purchases, indeed, in medical products in Belgium. And that sometimes is an eye-opener. And at the same time, we of course don't want to shift the cursor towards our own interest. And I think that that is probably the delicate balance in terms of having this information, this type of communication. It is good to have these eye-openers, but of course it's not the objective and it's not the goal of what we're working on. And we also have to, in a more honest partnership, know that our partners are also looking at these data. And we would not want them to have the impression that that is actually why we are engaging on international cooperation. So there's also, I think, less monetary examples. And so I think we, in the conversation and in the dialogue and in the narrative, we have to really bring them in as well. The less monetary conversation or example that we've been using is on pathogens. Because of working together with, for example, medical centers, research centers on the African continent, for example, our Institute of Tropical Medicine was able to identify the pathogens of Mpox And when in 2022 we had mpox in Antwerp, it was thanks to that knowledge that they were actually able to contain it very quickly and to respond very quickly. And this is also an example that I give and say, like, this is the future of global health. We're all interrelated, interconnected, and this is where we have to build mutual beneficial partnerships. And I think we have to get better at identifying these examples, using these data, and balancing them both from a very economic perspective, but also a mutual interest perspective.
Thank you so much. If I can move to Sarah now. Ireland's one of the few countries actually increasing its aid at the moment, which we're delighted by. And in a year's time, you'll be taking on the EU presidency during these crucial MFF negotiations. How can you rally other member states behind this leadership in advancing global action, and how can we help?
Is on? Yes, perfect. Great. Thank you very much. And thanks very much, Max, for the presentation, and Heidi for your comments. I suppose just as a starting or an opener on this, I mean, Ireland is very clear that our development cooperation is part of our values and of our interests. And there's a very strong value in staying the course and honouring commitments that have been made. And at an EU level, we really firmly hold that providing long-term support for sustainable development is central to our reliability and credibility. And a major shift away from this would really challenge our long-term interests. And I think both Max and Heidi have already provided some examples of this, of how we need to be thinking more broadly about both our interests, but also how they align with our values. And in that sense, we really believe that the next MMF should maintain the EU's leadership in providing development and humanitarian assistance in a sustained, long-term manner, and that external action financing must continue to defend the rules-based international order, democracy, multilateralism. We're here in Seville. This is a really important moment for bolstering that, but also human rights, gender equality, climate action, sustainable development, underpinned by the core principle of untied aid and the central promise of the 2030 agenda to leave no one behind. Maintaining the INDICI target of at least 93% of future development funding fulfilling the criteria for ODA, we believe would safeguard the integrity and effectiveness of EU development cooperation. And we were talking about how so much of the language of the Paris agenda is back. Maybe we need to phrase it differently, but we really can't forget about the principles of aid effectiveness in this context, as resources are scarce and we have to align it for more impact. But we also need to clearly differentiate the EU from other actors. A strong international partnerships and policy should be based on a mixture of approaches, including financial and technical cooperation, capacity and institutional building, sectoral budget support, pooled funding, impact investment funds, project and programme support. And it must involve different actors, governments, civil society, local authorities, private sector, where appropriate, and implementing partners, including member states, as well as development agencies, DFIs, ECAs, and the European DFIs as well, and the UN agencies. We believe that in this, different objectives should be pursued through appropriate instruments with dedicated financial envelopes and specific spending rules and implementing modalities. That is, instruments and funding for development cooperation, humanitarian assistance, and pre-accession support, ideally, in our view, should not be combined. There are a number of countries that support key principles to promote a strong EU development and international partnerships policy, and these are calling for retaining ambitious levels of ODA as the foundation of the EU's development cooperation and international partnerships. And we need to support and work with such countries to make sure that the EU continues to be a reliable partner. EU development cooperation has always focused on the principles of reliability and predictability through the use of multi-annual indicative programmes and annual implementation plans. And these provide the necessary framework for the achievement of long-term objectives. We really firmly believe that the EU and its member states need to be seen as reliable partners and partners that will remain stable and dependable, and that this is how we build our influence, and it is what will give us the standing to have our say on how to address major global challenges.
Thanks so much. And thank you for mentioning that the importance of both the ODA targets, but also the keeping the instruments within the EU budget. For anyone that's been following that debate, there is a a conversation about combining instruments that there's some concerns about. And you talked about reliability, predictability, and stability in partnership. That's a good segue to turn to Aggrey, Aluso. Aggrey, when you think from your perspective, sitting in Nairobi, what does a more mutually beneficial case for aid mean for civil society voices in particular in the Global South?
Thank you so much. Congratulations on that great report. I think it really illustrates the point that the question that you have asked. It's clear that ODA is not just a charitable tool, but a strategic investment that delivers mutual benefits to both sides, EU and Africa. And civil society organizations, I think we have had very clear perspectives in terms of what development priorities need to be given attention. We are always not successful, but I think one area of support that we have always counted on is the strategic thinking sometimes, and we hope this is something that institutionalized, particularly with the evolving relationship between EU and Africa, that we have sustained strategic investment that really prioritize human development sectors. Because we've seen with our unfortunate scenarios, which we hope will change, where we have rising levels of debt, we've seen consistent reduction in investment in human development sectors. And this coupled with the increasing population in Africa, risk making our bulging youth population a burden rather than, an investment. And I think that's something that, ODA can strategically catalyze investment around, while also incentivizing local domestic resourcing in ways that will make, recipient government, build on the same trends and help, address this currently not very encouraging scenario, because that has really exacerbated inequalities. And we believe that with strategic catalytic investment that ODA can demonstrate the importance of such investment, it can create policies, lasting policy solutions that would direct attention to those kind of investments. And I think also with the multiple overlapping crises that we are facing in this world, it's really clear that we need to have that global solidarity approach. We've seen what's happening in Africa in the recent past. We've had several disease outbreaks between the decade between 2012 and 2022. We've seen an increase in the rates of disease outbreaks, nearly 60%. And just as was elaborately, mentioned, that collaboration, like between Belgium and, for example, African countries and many other European countries, I think have really catalyzed innovation and have potential to catalyze innovations in ways that would help promote global health security. And we know if we all have that stability and assurance that we don't have to look at our back for the next outbreak, then we can invest with peace and we can reap the results of having that security. Other than also benefiting from that development that comes from the young people and the industries that I think we have seen from the study, how when the recipient countries are stable and have increased income, they also have the purchasing power to do better trade with the donor countries. And I think that is self-explanatory. But just as I wind up on my intervention, I think, of course, there are lessons that we have learned over the years and which we must incorporate in our collaborational engagements going forward, in terms of, how do we do things differently in ways that really advance this mutuality, that really push progress towards sustainability. I think there's more that can be done. And I think it has been demonstrated, we need to be more intentional in terms of how we build on these lessons and become more of partners, and particularly working with civil society organizations as equal partners, because I know traditionally interactions are between government to government. And, it's assumed that because they are democratically elected, they will do a program that reflects the wishes of the people. But we have seen challenges with accountability. So really investing in more of the institutions that would help promote accountability. And these are institutions that are really citizen-led and that are being driven by CSOs. I think that is an area that is can have a really good catalytic support towards that sustainability, but also, really just involving in a different model of partnership that let us co-create the agendas for collaboration and partnership in development. Thank you.
Thank you, Aggrey, for those thoughts. I'm going to turn now to Iliana. Thanks for being with us today. And so international cooperation is undergoing this substantial change right now, both in terms of funding, but also the donor landscape. With all of these competing priorities, how do you see the development cooperation agenda maintaining its place among political priorities?
Thank you. Thank you for. Yeah, it is on. Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you very much for organizing this and for inviting me to participate in this conversation. And maybe a first very quick answer to your question, and this is something that we have discussed with Heidy in previous conversations, is that somehow the development agenda has maintained its place. It has even increased its profile in, let's say, international relations or the global conversation. Let me just elaborate this a little bit more. Actually, this prominence is actually what is behind the fact that for 7 years in a row or 6 years in a row, aid levels have hit historic records. Because precisely in this context of geopolitical fragmentation, polycrisis, war, etc., part of the global answer, such as the distribution of vaccines, refugees cost, humanitarian aid, etc., was precisely an aid response. So that helped having aid in a prominent place in the international agenda, but also at the same time from the, let's say, development or development cooperation perspective, these also had this downside of spamming or scattering aid across a larger number of objectives and programs, and hence are reducing its effectiveness. So actually, this is also part of the solution and part of the problem. And this is something that we really need to figure out how to deal with. So that would be one idea. Maybe linking this with the general theme of the conversation, which is how to portray aid and development cooperation and the development agenda as something interesting for non-traditional stakeholders, for the society of the donor countries as a whole, even for political parties that are not naturally keen on promoting this policy. And in addition to all the economic rationale that Maximiliano has very well expressed, I think there is, and this is somehow behind the different interventions that were shared with us, there is also a political factor that is important. And in that sense, let me just share a very brief story. Since we are in Spain and there are a number of Spaniards in the room, Spanish aid was cut by 75% 14, 15 years ago. This was done as a response to the financial crisis. And somehow, well, it was responding to domestic fiscal issues, but also it was a response to the international agenda itself, because this fiscal response was expected on the part of Spanish partners in the EU and the OECD. And this happened, and because we tend to think that those political cycles are also aligned with different political parties in power, and just to say that the largest part of the cut was conducted by the same political party that had increased aid dramatically just a few years before that, which is the same political party that is governing the country right now. So the same political party that is, along with Ireland, increasing aid when the rest of the members are decreasing aid, and the same country that is hosting the 4th International Conference for Financing for Development. So this is just to say that different responses to aid can be made by the same stakeholders in different moments in time. What has changed between 2011 and now, well, there are, of course, very large number of factors, but I would say that one of them is realizing that aid can also be a tool for international governance and for the country's influence at the regional and the international level. This has also come with a more vocal role, let's say, of Spain in the development ecosystem, both regionally in Europe and internationally. Just two additional points on the message and on the messenger. So on the message, well, there is an issue with the jargon that Heidy has already pointed out. So just transitions, triple nexus. Yeah, so for most of the people, those words don't mean anything. So probably, yeah, the need to use words that mean actual things for people that would help. And also, I like very much Aggrey's point on human development, because the final goal, the end game, needs also to be clear. So the why is there, so it makes sense. Also, it has an impact on EU imports, EU exports, consumption, GDP. Yeah, but what for exactly? And in that sense, probably the MDGs were more functional for let's say, for the public communication of ODA and development cooperation. MDGs were more functional than the 2030 agenda. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not proposing to get back to the MDGs after 2030. But the fact, even though the 2030 agenda is much more sophisticated from the intellectual point of view, it shows the complexity of the development processes, it shows the connection between the political, the economic, the ecological sphere. It is a very complex agenda, very wide agenda for most of the societies, both in the north and in the south. It's a difficult thing to understand and seize, and hence an agenda that can also be misinterpreted, or maybe used as a political weapon more easily by populist parties. There is also something that is in the 2030 agenda that might have backfired. Is this narrative of the end of the North and the South divide, and the fact that the development is everywhere and development challenges are everywhere, and that problems are common to both the North and the South, because part of the answer can be, so if we are, if this is the end of the North and the South, and the South has catch up, and big new powers are in the South, then I mean, there is no case anymore for development cooperation. So this is not to say, again, I'm not proposing to go back to a very simplistic, narrow agenda on social basic needs, but this is really something that we need to reflect on as a community. And my last point, I'm sorry, because I'm being a bit long, but just one point about the messenger. So what happened also is that during the 90s, the 2000s, and that was very functional, because it also helped trigger the aid effectiveness and then the development effectiveness agendas. The aid lobby was extremely critical with development policy. So development policy was just something about the donor's interest, economic and political interest, and very marginally it had an impact on development in the South. And then suddenly the budgets start being cut, and this also happened in Spain, we know that, and suddenly children are dying. So either it only serves the interest of the donors, or it has an impact on development, but the narrative needs to be consistent. So I think that has also had a very negative impact on the relevance of aid. So I think that my last message on this would be, yeah, the messengers need to be consistent in their aid narratives. And I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Lots of food for thought there. And I think that point about consistency is interesting, because I guess with this report, what we're hoping to do is also, and I'm going to quote MEP Barry Andrews from Ireland, who said, this shows that we can do well while also doing good. And that's a kind of simple language, easy to understand message, where we maybe support both kinds of narrative and don't have to make the choice. And I'm going to come to the floor soon, so please prepare your questions, and maybe some people from our online audience as well. But if I may, before that, I'd love to turn particularly to Heidy and to Sarah. Heidy, you mentioned the importance of this partnerships on pathogens at Pandemic Action Network. We're very conscious of, you know, all of the cooperation that happened during COVID. And I think there is this interesting phase that we're in whereby it's never been more obvious how interconnected the world is and how our struggles are common. And yet we have this pressure on the internationalization element of some of our policies. Is there a case to say, and do you think it can fly, that actually the EU budget is a place where maybe EU member states can think of being a bit more ambitious on this international agenda, that's not only about over there, but all of our common interests in terms of some of these interlinked priorities?
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think you point out to indeed where, you know, the element of the global public goods, right? This realization that there's these challenges, you know, climate, stability, global health. There's not a single country that is big enough, strong enough, or rich enough to deal with them on their own. And I think that is, at the same time, these challenges also pose the typical collective action challenge. So from that perspective, I think indeed we need to find spaces where we can come together and overcome the collective action problem. So if the EU budget could be that space, I think that could be very interesting. What I do believe is that you can never, in a way, put it away. So I would also still argue very much for a consistent member state engagement there as well. I don't think we will have to come to a situation where we sort of outsource that issue to the EU, because then we will lose ground and it will not be carried anymore. And I think that that is something, and again, it comes down to the conversation on communication. Maybe we've not, as a community internationally, not been so good in terms of communicating all these elements, why it is so important, because we're losing out the connection also to our population. The support in many of the European populations also for international cooperation has gone down. So I would say yes, from a budgetary perspective, but I would say, like, let's also be careful not to disintegrate. And I think we really have to make sure that member states and populations stay on board and really try to see what the interest is. I mean, we've all been walking around in Sevilla, and so then all of a sudden you realize climate change is real and these temperatures are just really very problematic. And we will have to invest. We will have to invest in climate. We will have to invest in sustainable food systems. And this is not just a one single member state. We need to come together in that collectivity, but actually it's a global endeavor. And that is for me also where we need to put the cursor right on these mutual beneficial partnerships. What I hear sometimes is that the world has become so much more transactional. And I think that transactional in and of itself can be interpreted in very different ways. Because I think also in the panel already, it was mentioned that it is good to be transparent. It's good to be transparent about what your interest is. We don't have to hide. And I think maybe in the past, sometimes also that was hide. I think as adults, we can come together and put our cards on the table. but from a long-term perspective, investing in these global public goods, investing in real mutual beneficial partnerships. And I think that is, for me, the challenge for us now is what are the parameters to define these real mutual beneficial partnerships? I really don't believe in short-term transactional tit-for-tat approaches. This would really undermine all of our efforts, I think. And I think that that is something that we have to guard together and collectively. We're either way not even in a position to have short-term transactional costs in terms of what do we bring to the table. So let's invest in that longer-term mutual beneficial partnership.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Sarah, if I can turn to you and ask a bit of a different question about the leadership that you're showing on this international issue. Can you tell us a bit about how you're telling that story on the domestic front and how you're engaging and hopefully inspiring and winning the support of your people for the leadership that you're showing?
Great, thanks. And no, I've been very struck actually by this sort of common thread in terms of the narratives on development. It's something a lot of us have been speaking about. And I mean, Ireland has enjoyed strong public support cross-party for the development programme for a long time, which has remained steady, but it hasn't remained intact. And I mean, we're very conscious that we can't remain complacent about that there's a lot of uncertainty in the world and around Ireland, in Europe, and that these things, Ireland is not somehow, you know, immune to any of these things. So some of what we, you know, I think this theme of consistency is really very important. I mean, part of what we've done through our development program with our domestic government, we've managed to put the SDGs onto the national curriculum in the schools, and we're constantly surprised by how much the kids understand, you know, that they get it, you know, they understand it as a vision of how the world works and is interconnected. And we're very conscious then you can't sort of pivot and then decide, well, we're not going to talk about the SDGs anymore when you have actually, you know, managed to sort of educate people about how this sort of vision works. So we have to remain consistent no matter what messages we're giving out. And we're very conscious that we're part of a broader European Union and that there are different currents and different views there. But that doesn't mean that you somehow find some lowest common denominator or some way of kind of trying to square that circle with a very minimalist view. That there has to be a way, again, of being consistent with what's happening. I think Heidi's just mentioned that across domestic environments into one polity. And I mean, one thing, and sort of seen Nalima there, that we've, you know, definitely focused on that in recent years, making the case for development has often focused on crises. I mean, necessarily, you know, you talk a lot about humanitarian crises or preventing a humanitarian crisis or building resilience for a climate shock. And in some ways, like the MDGs were mentioned by Iliana there, but we are also sort of focusing a little bit now, but no, we need to actually make just a positive case that it's worth investing in development as people's futures. It's worth talking about why it matters for girls to go to school, why maternal health is so important, why nutrition matters for generational change, not just in terms of crises. And it obviously has to be balanced in there, but it's certainly something that our current government is also very strongly focused on, and not about changing everything that you do in line with that narrative, but using that in such a way to be able to actually communicate with the public about this broader case for development. And I think I absolutely agree that you can't just focus on short-term goals or identify we're doing 3 things into international space because we think that, you know, we can demonstrate value for money and immediate impact. If you've no vision for what that's contributing to, it has to be going somewhere. Otherwise, it's quite empty. And very quickly over time, you know, even if you present it in terms of interests, your interests and values will converge over time regardless. So if it is a short-term transaction, it will die without a vision for where it's supposed to be going. So I think we are very much trying to hold on, but not being complacent and trying to refresh how we talk about development and humanitarian and climate in an integrated way, rather than seeing them as sort of separate buckets that you somehow have to address because one is short-term and one is long-term in different ways. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up to the floor. Do we have any questions? I see one in the front row, one in the second row. The microphone is coming. You could introduce yourself when you speak. I'll take a couple of questions first.
All right. Hi, good morning, everyone. Mintu Pham with Project Starling. Great panel. I would love to delve into the report, or I hope you can distribute it, because it's just fascinating research. So thank you for doing that and trying to model what we think may be the returns for some of the countries that are investing in development. So maybe a couple of questions, if that's okay. One is just at a country level, are you able to then track what an individual country provides for aid, and then how that then is returned, and how is that distributed over various countries? Are certain countries in the EU more likely to have that one-to-one ratio impact versus others? It would be interesting to see that. And then secondly, I'm, as you can tell from my accent, I'm an American, an adopted American. Obviously, these are really ripe questions in our context. Marco Rubio just yesterday issued his letter as to why they've shut down the U.S. Agency for International Development. And the arguments there are just hit right to the issues that you've just raised here. And a lot of it is misinformation. A lot of it is mischaracterizing the impact of aid. And I wonder, maybe just as from a research perspective or modeling, whether that's something that selfishly we can apply to a U.S. context, and then what that might look like. And if that's something that you think is possible, would love to just connect with you on that. And then secondly, to Iliana's point about Global South, Global North, SDGs kind of merging the differences between the two. And that in this world of kind of renewed or rethinking development cooperation, what the role of the Global North is vis-a-vis the Global South, being maybe confused a bit. I just wanted to have the panelists delve into that a little bit more and to see, is it sort of asking, having your cake and eating it too for developing countries to say, we still want 0.7%. Oh, and by the way, we're now really empowered and we need to be able to fend for ourselves. So just, I think that's a really ripe conversation now. So I'd just love for you all to address that more directly. Thanks.
Great questions. Thank you. I'll take a couple more before coming to the panel.
Hello, I'm Aluso from Salud por Derecho. Thank you very much for the panel. I'm very much looking forward to delve into methodology. I had a question, and I know the report is mostly focused on the quantitative side of impact, and also interested in the qualitative part. And had a couple of questions that are interrelated. The first one is, and both of them are kind of related to this challenge of cross-sectoral collaboration. The first one would be, and I'm very glad that Heidy mentioned the scientific collaboration on pathogen identification and so on. My question would be, how do we make aid principles of solidarity, justice, or influence other sectors such as industry or science collaboration? So it's not just that we get access to pathogens, but the people that provide the pathogens get access to vaccines whenever there's a pandemic. And in an opposite way, I'm interested in knowing how do we deal with this situation in which aid policies are influenced by other sectors such as security and, well, mostly security, and I'm talking about migration policies and how aid funding has been dedicated to securitize the border in Europe. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Great questions. I've got a couple more. One more before some answers.
I'll try to be quick. Thank you so much. My name is Maria Santillán from the Canary Royal Institute. I actually have a couple of questions. One is building on your previous question on the differential impact from the study, depending on different European member states. You did mention in one of the slides that you observed greater value impact in countries like Germany, France, and Italy, I think you said. I was wondering, is the value impact greater as the aid budget increases or not necessarily? I'm not sure what the evidence says about that. And also on a methodological question is whether I assume you're taking kind of the whole aid budget from the donor aid budget, basically, and not necessarily differentiating into the geographical allocation of aid if it, the return on investment is greater when it's invested in a particular region or another. I'm not sure if you do that. And then my other question, also kind of building on a previous one, is mostly to Heidi. You were talking earlier about, using the vocabulary of the people that you're trying to talk to. And I wonder, now there's this whole idea that because in the EU countries, we have to increase our defense budget, that means we have to cut our ODA budget. And I was wondering, from that kind of using a vocabulary that other people also understand perspective, how can we balance this narrative, to convey the message that it doesn't have to be one or the other? Thank you.
Thanks. Do we sneak in one more? Frederic, I think.
Thank you. Frédéric Roeder from the Global Solidarity Levies Task Force. So first of all, I wanted to say a huge thank you for organizing this event, because as much as I love the discussions in Sevilla, it sometimes feels a little bit as if we're in a bubble and we're not in a world where we're seeing the most massive aid cuts ever. So I think it's really important to have that discussion. And I'm actually building on the previous question on does it have to be one or the other? I think it is very important what you're doing here, and also, as you discussed, leveraging different processes at the national and EU level. But another way of going about it, and it's a complementary way, is obviously to tap into new sources of financing to increase concessional resources for development, for climate. On Monday, a number of countries launched a new coalition to tax premium flights and private jets, which go mostly untaxed as we speak, to raise additional financing for climate and development. And I think it would be interesting to hear in particular, obviously, panelists from Ireland and Belgium on this question. Also, as we're just a couple of weeks away of opening the discussion on the own resources at the EU level. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn back to our panel now. Max, could I ask you to come in on some of those questions as a recap? There was the question about country level. There was the question about when the aid budget goes up, does it increase the return? And so if you could start there, that'd be great.
Yes, thank you for the questions. Yes, on respect of the question about the country level, we got the impact, basically how this impact on the EU sort of distributes to each country. We haven't basically worked out what would be basically the sort of return from how each of these countries sort of contributing to that budget. We haven't done that, and we haven't actually also included the individual countries' development assistance. That is not included. So we haven't done that, but basically what we know is, based on the economics behind the model, how is that the impact sort of channel through each of the EU countries. And I think that there was a question of basically in relation of why the largest countries were benefiting the most. It's not related to because they are giving more aid in this context. It is because they are the largest exporters and the largest economies of the EU. So a small change in GDP of 1.01% in dollars and euros, that would be a larger chunk in Germany or in France than in Estonia, for example. Even that for Estonia actually is on percentage terms, that was a larger. There was also a question in relation also on trying to capture the impact by region. So trying to say whether, I am just imagining whether assisting, giving more to Sub-Saharan Africa will have a higher return on the EU. That is possible actually because the model, we haven't actually do that, but the model actually gives us actually what is sort of the impact on each of the recipient countries as well. We aggregated all sub-Saharan Africa in one region, but we could go in to look into each of the countries. So that is a possibility of doing, to try to capture that type of analysis. And I think that the last point is returning to whether this could potentially be done in the US, or to actually capture this sort of impact of the US aid. Well, absolutely. There are studies that have been done similar to this, applied to the Netherlands, but we did one on the UK. There is one on Germany as well. So it's definitely, you can sort of apply this, not only my technique, but actually econometric techniques as well, or actually try to capture what is that the US aid actually might be missing actually by the policy they are undertaking. Yes, absolutely.
Thanks so much, Max. Can I ask Aggrey to maybe come in on this point that Mintu raised about on the one hand pushing for more aid, on the other hand the desire to be more empowered at the local level. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that has been the dilemma. And I think in a recent reflection that we had in Nairobi, I think on April 30th, we had a dedicated session to really reflect on this evolving landscape. And we brought community representation right from the grassroots just to hear their perspectives in terms of what they think. So it's something that people have different perspectives around, but I think one common thing that was clear, that the world needs this collaboration. We need solidarity-based approaches that recognize that we are different levels of development and we have to address certain challenges collectively. But I think the question that is now, that is inherent in all this is, how do we do it in ways that does not create perpetual dependency, in ways that build incremental capacity for different regions to be able to manage their affairs, progressively, and not having to all the time rely on aid, and progress to different issues and be able to become even donors themselves. So there was that ambition spelled out. And therefore, I think my analysis and my reflection from the different views I hear from our community collaborators is that we would want to see progressive, approaches that really reflect the needs, and that is benched. And I think somebody talked about what principles should be underpinning this collaboration. It should be those solidarity-driven, principles that, from the point of departure, we are clear that we are doing this in ways that is transparent and open, like Africa CDC in its blueprint for new vision for public health order talks about mutually beneficial relationships. And I think that's what many within the African context are asking for. Look, let's do things because they must be done in this way. We cannot afford to not collaborate and work in solidarity, but we do them in ways that is building the agency and the voices of the citizenry to demand what needs to be demanded, and for the governments to be responsible eventually. Thank you.
Thanks, Aggrey. I'm going to turn to Heidy and Sarah on a couple of questions we got. I want to flag the one on how do we turn access to pathogens into access to countermeasures and vaccines too, but also this question from Frederic about new sources of financing, especially in the context of the forthcoming MFF. Is there a case, for example, for setting the money that we know we need and then trying to find more creative routes to get there, for example, through the flight levies, and really opening up our creativity now, both at the EU level on own resources, but more broadly on development finance? It'd be great to hear your country perspectives or personal perspectives on those things. Thank you. Maybe to Heidy first.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, of course, the whole access to pathogens has been very sensitive, right? Also in the COVID, our COVID trauma, if you allow me to say it that way. And I think it was the big thing in the pandemic treaty, right? The whole conversation on that. When I think about that, for me, it is very much, it comes down to having that cursor at the right spot of the mutual beneficial partnerships. We have very good examples. And for example, this collaboration on the mpox is actually between two institutions, a Congolese and a Belgian one, that also decades ago, they discovered Ebola together. And so this is not just a short-term transactional thing. There is this long-term partnership, and it is building the capacity of both, because both institutions are really learning from one another. And so I think that is what it is about, how to really define that. Not just we have a crisis, we fly in, get the pathogens, take them out and use them for our own interest. And I think that is indeed where we need to have the approach right. And I think there's many opportunities, because in the health sphere, we talk about pathogens. But for example, in the agricultural sphere, a couple of weeks ago, a Belgian expert in a Mexican research center, CIMMIT, was invited to NATO to talk about the relationship between food security and security, because you also asked that question about security. Now, security is very wide in and of itself. Indeed, you have border security, but what about food security and the interrelation between protecting actually seeds, fundamental seeds from diseases for our food security? And if we're not able to do so, how it will impact on global stability. And so I think we have to understand these interconnections better. The drought resilient crops, for example, there is a lot of experience and a lot of expertise on the African continent that we can use. Look at the temperatures here again in Sevilla and all over Europe right now. We need crop resilient expertise. And so again, it's about sharing that knowledge for our common future and the global goods. On security, again, we do have partnerships, for example, port security. And there's very legitimate issues also of strengthening security in terms of drug controls, etc., and goods imports, etc. And again, it's all about getting the cursor right and the balance right. And that's where the whole migration debate is about. It's, it should not be about being restrictive and just pushing back, but there is also another conversation on migration going on, namely skills mobility. Europe needs more skills in the very short future. And so again, this conversation is not black and white, but I think, again, there are windows of opportunity for mutual beneficial partnerships. I also want to tie it a bit to I think your neighbor had a question on the defense issues as well, and how we can actually, I think it was something, how can we also use that, or the vocabulary we need to adjust? Let me share an experience. We have tried very hard. Two elements. We have argued that we need 3% for 3D. Defense, diplomacy, and development. Defense needed 2%. In the meantime, that 2% NATO norm has shifted a bit, but it used to be 2%. 0.7 for development, 0.3 for diplomacy, because they're interrelated. And indeed, we actually see that. And I think it would be a call for me to all of you to bring out that story sharper. We don't want to go to war. We don't want to go to war. And if we have to go to war, 2% or even more will just not be enough. So we have to invest to prevent a war. We have to invest in diplomacy and international cooperation. These are your preventive measures. And so we actually have to bring out that story. I don't think we've exceeded yet, so please join us in trying. And I think we have to bring out these stories sharper. Taxation is not my field of expertise, I have to say. I hear interesting ideas. Difficult for me to estimate to what extent they can be successful, but let me add another one to it. Since we're investing a lot in defense these days, I've already heard a taxation on defense companies. They will yield huge profits, probably because of all these investments. Can we tax them and let that taxation flow back to international cooperation? I think I would vote for that. But again, it's not my field of expertise, and I'm only one citizen to vote that day, if that day would come.
Thank you so much. Sarah, could I get you to come in?
Thanks very much. There's an awful lot I can align with there, so I'll be very brief because I know we're almost out of time. I mean, really struck by the questions very much. I mean, the challenge is it's that there are a lot of very intense competing priorities for resources, you know, particularly defense, migration, security, but also domestic pressures, you know, in domestic social sectors, cost of living. It is a difficult time in Europe, which I can speak to. And we have that work to do when we're communicating the narrative of development, of making sure that it's not setting up this necessary trade-off. And it has come through very strongly from some governments who are cutting that it is one for one. And I mean, really, we have a job in there. And I suppose I was very struck by your point, you know, that the world needs this collaboration, and kind of paraphrasing what you said, or kind of turning it around. Development challenges aren't going away. It's not as if by somehow not focusing on them or turning to national issues that we can just sort of forget about what's happening elsewhere in the world. And if we stop financing them, we're going to have to engage them at some point, whether it be to engage with the situations of conflict, in dealing with pandemics, in dealing with disasters and the moral issues that come with that. So I think really the focus would be that no matter how we're financing development, we have to focus on the human impact. We also have to focus on value for money. And I think some studies in the UK have shown that while there is actually quite strong support for development as a good thing to do, there's very little belief in value for money that it offers. And there's a job that we have to do to really demonstrate that it is having impact, and that it's not generating dependency. And I think that you know, certainly the news over the last few days, just in terms of the absolute impact of some of the cuts, will really bring home both the human impact, the value for money, but also the issues of dependency. And we really have to challenge that no matter what the mechanism is. So I won't engage on the taxation issues, but I think that those issues are going to come up no matter what the source of financing for this is. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We could just turn to Iliana now before we turn to Vanessa for some closing reflections.
Thank you very much. Yes, maybe a couple of things on the 0.7 and on the Global South. So although the 0.7 target has been extremely functional in driving efforts and political commitment, and to build, I mean, around it a conversation on international commitments and development cooperation, especially I would say in the EU. It also has some downsides. On the one hand, putting the focus on the means rather than on the ends. I know that this is a very weird comment in the context of a conference on the means, but we are having these conversations on the means in the context of the ends. So yes, but the 0.7 has been also sometimes been discussed in isolation with regards the development, the agenda. And that also has misled in a way, because for a number of stakeholders, there is this idea that the goals are the 17 goals within the 2030 agenda, and the means are just the development cooperation funds, the official development assistance funds. So obviously, if those are the means and those are the ends, the perception that aid is ineffective is going to be argued, because of course it's impossible to achieve all these goals with just aid budgets. And the last reason why I think it could be misguiding in the current context is because it is a very old target set in the 70s, relating to in the context of a very different world. And today, with the competing agendas that also Heidy has described, of course, we have on the one hand this very old target, and on the other hand an existential threat. And of course, it will be easier to put forward a 2%, 3%, 4%, 5% target in defense than a 0.7 target in ODA. So that's why one of the reasons that explains this contradiction. On the Global South, I think that, yeah, what needs probably in Europe is a more granular approach and understanding of the South, of what the South is, because and again, this takes me back to this idea that the 2030 agenda shows the world as if we were all in the same situation. We are not. The Global South, not all countries or not all populations in the Global South are in the same situation. You can have big power like China, middle powers like the US, Brazil and South Africa, regional leaders like Indonesia, but at the same time, as Sarah rightly pointed out, you have problems of food security, poverty, hunger, child mortality, etc. And better showing those differences also in the conversations that we are having in Europe is, I think, another way forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to turn to Vanessa, our partner from Salud por Derecho, to give a few closing reflections.
Hello? Yes. Well, thank you. Thank you, Eloise. Thank you very much for all the panelists, for your insights. Maximiliano, thank you for your research and also for the questions. There is a sound? No? Okay, thank you. So, well, I'm going to try to articulate some of or to highlight some of the comments that you have made. But first of all, a big part of the function of the European Union, no, and the funding exchange among member states has based on the principle of social cohesion among the member states. No, I know that this is very difficult to understand, the ODA or the European aid, no, for the outside of the European borders, no. But I feel like this would be also the principle. Well, I think that the conclusions that your report has shown us is very important in order to convince, no, stakeholders that normally are not in our field or are not so supportive of ODA. I think that the numbers that you have put on the table are going to be very important in order to push forward the countries for the MFF negotiation. I think it's important to highlight that NGOs are asking an important increasing of the ODA to 200 billion euros for the next MFF. And I think your numbers are going to support very well that ask. Also, well, regarding funding, I'm going to be like disconnected in my articulations, but I think it's very important what the colleague from the levies point out, no? The FTT, the Financial Transaction Task, very familiar to all of us, is still there, no? And I think there are a lot of room of improvement on that, no? Very few countries has implemented, and some of them in a very limited version. So there are more room of implementing this new innovative funding mechanism, and also to invest the revenues on global solidarity and climate change, because so far very few countries has done so. Also, I would like to highlight. Sorry, because I lost my glasses. I extended too much. Sorry. I lost my glasses and I can see very well what I write down. I think it's very thank you, Peter. Oh my God. So thank you. Well, I think it's interesting the comment from Iliana saying that although many countries are cutting the ODA, the swell is like international cooperation. No, it's important. And I think it's interesting to have this in mind. And also the framework of the mutual beneficiary partnership that Heidy mentioned. Although this, I think is very, very important to have into account also that ODA is not the mean that we have, and that the policy coherence, as we were discussing, is very, very important, in terms of supportive development, not only with money, but also with the policies that we as a region put on the table. Very difficult, sorry, to go over the notes, but and also I would like to highlight the comments from Aggrey regarding the importance of the role as catalyzing domestic financing, domestic investment at country level, and also the need of supporting civil society and young people in the countries. Also, just to finish, to highlight the need of long-term investments that Sarah also mentioned, to invest on public goods and the kind of solidarity principles in dealing with all these problems. Okay, thank you, and thank you.
Thanks so much. So I'd like, unfortunately, Sarah had to leave, but I'd like you to give her and the rest of our brilliant panel a huge round of applause. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. A lot of people asked about the report. The QR code is on the screen. You can get access to all the resources. There's a technical report. There's a policy briefing. ODI did a fantastic job for us, and they have done other studies, and I think would be able to do more. And I think I just want to say another thing. Pandemic Action Network, alongside the One Campaign, Global Citizen, and AIDS Funds, has set up something called the MFF Hub. And this is an everybody welcome think tanks, NGOs. We are trying to be louder and more numerous than ever to say we need an ambitious aid budget in the next MFF. And we will be doing our best to be as loud as possible and supportive as possible to get those numbers up, maybe using new creative resources. But thank you so much to everyone for making the time today. And thank you to our brilliant partners, ODI, Joop Lang Institute, Salud por Derecho. And one more round of applause for our panel, please. Thank you so much. Have a great day.